GPT, which in and of itself is kind of revolutionizing a lot of how we're doing work and marketing and ideas and creating ideas. But anything else you'd kind of recommend?
I mean, there's plenty of ways that you can approach some of these obstacles. Um, you know, like the argument that this is a tired story, it might be tired internally. It doesn't necessarily mean it's tired externally. Especially if you're doing acquisition. Acquisition, you're grabbing new people, and theoretically they haven't seen, or they've rarely seen any of these stories. So there's some opportunity there. Uh, One of the things that is always compelling is looking at something from different viewpoints. Back in I think late '90s now, there's a video game that revolutionized a number of things. It was called Half-Life, and it was a first-person shooter. But they actually created, I believe it was 4 different versions of that game, or there was at least 3. So there was the main storyline, but there were actually 2 different games you could buy that were storylines of different characters within the game. It was the same game, but from different points of view, and so like from that perspective, you can do things with different points of view and create that. I've seen like a mailing where the main mailing was from one point of view, and the reminder mailing was like from the spouse's point of view,
Oh,
and
interesting.
just like create that environment. So there's some interesting ways that you could approach that.
Okay, cool. And what about yourself, Charlotte? Sorry, I feel like I actually was supposed to send this one to you first and then Kirk. But anyways, opposite order.
Well, I'm confident we'll all survive. Yeah, like to build on that idea of like, oh, this story is tired. I always think about like, okay, when I'm running a campaign, I'm like, this plot thread couldn't be more obvious. This is so obvious. They're absolutely going to figure it out. I've made this idiot proof. They're getting there. And then my players are all like, we're not really sure what we're supposed to do. And then conversely, I often find myself as a player sitting there being like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do next. I can see like 75 options. So it's easy to forget as the writer or the creator of the story, you bring
Sure.
so much contextual knowledge that your reader doesn't share. They don't spend every day thinking about this like you do. And the amount of stuff that you take for granted as obvious is enormous. So you're probably looking at it thinking, I don't have any stories, but like the tiniest little granule of information to you is a whole story to somebody else because you still need to set up all that context. You still need to build the world. The
Yeah.
other thing I
Love that.
often think about, like when I'm making the connection between D&D and storytelling, is like I know that there is you don't want to be cliched or tropey, but sometimes it's helpful to lean into that shared knowledge. So like if you're at the first session of a game and everyone walks into a tavern, you're like, I bet I know what's going to happen next. If you've played a few role playing games, you have a good sense that, like, that's the classic starting place for many campaigns. Everyone meets in a tavern, something happens, you get contracted or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can lean onto that shared knowledge of things like that, of those tropes to help create that relevance, help people understand, oh, where does this fit? And that can make it a little bit easier too if you're having a really hard time figuring out, like, we don't have the content. It's like you probably do. You're just, a lot of it is implied or shared, and all you have to do is make it explicit, and suddenly you have created a much larger piece of content.
And jumping on that tropes idea too, one of the things I've done in D&D campaigns is I will have plenty of places where it is completely safe. There are no traps, like nothing's a surprise, and people get very comfortable in that space, and then you hit them. And so you can do that with stories. You can kind of have the like, oh, this is the typical story from this charity, this is the typical story, and then you throw something at them that is completely different, and it creates a different response. It allows people to see things from kind of a different perspective, and now they go there, but it actually involves intentionally almost lulling people on a certain path until you're ready to kind of drop that on them. So there's things you can do with pacing, not just in a single letter, but even in like multiple appeals in order to create kind of the effect you want.
Cool. I like that a lot. And I think there's something to be said for what you're describing there with the idea that generationally your donors may very much be changing, right? So storytelling that you may have done over the past, especially if you're like kind of a legacy nonprofit that's had a long story, right? Or donors who have been involved for 10, 15, who knows how long, that same story that you've been telling may not resonate with a new generation of donors in the same way. And I think segmentation and potentially your stories being somewhat segmented, the story that you send along, it'll be interesting to see how that influences nonprofit marketing and fundraising, because I think there is going to be something to be said for how those stories are going to continue, and maybe that change up in story, does it not only shake up your current donors, but does it provide a new story for your new donors that you're trying to acquire, trying to steward? Do they need new stories because they need that change up to know your nonprofit is growing and changing as well, right? The story is growing and changing. Your nonprofit story is growing and changing. And I just know it's a piece that there's a lot of conversations about generations and donors out there right now. Have you seen any anecdotal organizations kind of specializing their message within, segmentation?
For me, I think the place I see this popping up the most actually is in orgs that have had big mission shifts, because your OG donors probably came in on a very different version of your cause than your newer donors. So how do you speak to the people who came in because they really liked this part of your work that either you do less of, or maybe you don't do it at all? Your mission now is related, but it's not the same. And so in a given piece of communication, either you're trying to tell a story in a couple of ways so it resonates with different value systems, or you're segmenting your communications, which frankly, I don't have tons of orgs who do. More often I'm seeing column A, where it's like, okay, I know that these are the values I need to hit on here, and I'm going to hit on them, and I'm going to sort of shotgun it. It's just simpler for most organizations to do. But I do think that there's the piece of the puzzle that, like, the bar doesn't have to be so high. Like, storytelling doesn't have to be like, oh my God, you got to find a story. It's going to be really hard. Like, all you really need is like, there was a problem and here's how we solved it. Like, that's the whole story. It can be that simple.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's great answers. And yeah, there's just the shift. I love how much conversation there is around storytelling, but you're right. Like, is there a base component that we're kind of almost overthinking too happening? Okay, so we're really gonna